this?
This case calls Jennifer Micholan.
Raise your right hand, please. Do you solemnly swear or affirm that the testimony that you're about to give in this cause will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth?
I do.
Thank you, ma'am.
Come this way. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
If you would please introduce yourself and spell your name for us.
My name is Jennifer Micholan, Jennifer, Micholan, Michelon.
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
Tell the jury, where do you work?
I work for the Hillsboro County Sheriff's Office in the Firearms section of the Forensic Service Bureau.
How long have you worked with HCSO in the Firearms section?
I've worked there for 2 years.
What's your title?
I'm a Forensic Laboratory Firearms Analyst.
I'm writing that down so I don't get it wrong. Forensic Laboratory Firearms Analyst. What does a Forensic Laboratory Firearms Analyst do?
My main duties are to determine whether or not ammunition components, such as a fired bullet or a fired cartridge case, were fired in the same firearm or from a specific firearm, firearm function and safety testing, serial number restoration, and database entry.
Before you started at HCSO, did you work elsewhere also with firearms?
Yes, I did.
Where did you work?
I worked for the Florida Department of Law Enforcement in the Firearms section of the Tampa Crime Lab.
What was your title when you worked for the Florida Department of Law Enforcement? We also call it FDLE in the Firearms Department.
My title when I left was Senior Crime Laboratory Analyst.
What did you do at Florida Department of Law Enforcement as a Senior Crime Laboratory Analyst?
I did the same thing that I'm doing at Hillsboro County Sheriff's Office.
So let's go back to your education and your background in firearms. Tell the jury what your training and your education background is in firearms.
I have a bachelor's degree in chemistry from the University of South Florida, and I completed an 18-month structured training program at the Florida Department of Law Enforcement in the field of firearms identification.
What year did you start working at FDLE?
I began working at FDLE in 2006.
When you started working with FDLE in 2006, did you receive specialized training in order to become a crime laboratory analyst?
When I began with FDLE in 2006, I was in a different section. I started in firearms in 2009.
So in 2009 at FDLE, explain to us what training that you underwent in order to be working in the firearms section at FDLE.
The 18-month structured training program that I went through included units in firearms function and safety testing, which included assembly and disassembly of firearms in order to know how they work. I did units in microscopy of bullets, microscopy of cartridge cases, firearms history and development, ammunition history and development. I did units in serial number restoration, distance determination, and I also completed then I completed an oral board, which was essentially 3.5 hours of question after question, making sure I understood everything in the firearms section. During that time, I also completed I had to do competency tests and also had to do practicals in order to be able to complete my training. After I completed all of that, I did 6 months of supervised casework, which was then culminated with a mock trial of testimony, and then I was released to do supervised casework. I'm not supervised, my own casework.
Do you have to have an official certification in order to be completely done with all of this training to do your own casework?
I received just a completion of the training program from the Florida Department of Law Enforcement.
When you worked at FDLE in the forensic or the firearms department, approximately how many times did you have an occasion to analyze a firearm?
I did not count how many times I had an opportunity to analyze a firearm, but at this point it's in the thousands.
When you started at HCSO, approximately how many times since you've joined HCSO have you had an occasion to analyze a firearm?
Hundreds.
Have you testified in court as a firearms expert before?
Yes, I have.
Approximately how many times?
More than 60?
Your Honor, at this time, I tender the witness as an expert in the area of firearms to
Any questions?
No question.
All right, you can proceed.
help us understand. We have, during the course of this trial, heard terms such as projectile and casing. Are those things that you analyze in your capacity as a forensic lab firearms analyst at HCSO?
Yes.
Let's start with a projectile. Walk us through, what is a projectile?
A projectile is the portion, it is also called a bullet. That is the part of a cartridge that will go down the barrel of a firearm when it is fired.
What about a casing? What is a casing?
A cartridge case is the Tupperware container of the cartridge itself. It will hold the bullet at the top. The cartridge case holds inside of it the gunpowder. And at the very head stamp or the bottom of the cartridge case, you will see the primer. On the head stamp of that cartridge case is usually the brand and the caliber.
So a projectile, is that word synonymous with or the same as a bullet in layman's terms?
Yes.
You refer to the cartridge casing. We've heard the term casing. Are those two words or terms synonymous, the same thing?
Yes, I call it a cartridge case. I will hear the word casing.
Now, when you are analyzing a firearm, what is the purpose of analyzing a firearm?
When I'm looking at a firearm, I'm looking at it to see that all of the safeties are working, that there's no damage to the firearm. I want to make sure it's safe for me to fire when the time comes. Then the next step would be to test fire that firearm and obtain those test fires in order to look at those test fires to do any comparisons to any evidence of cartridge cases or bullets that I might receive.
When you receive a firearm and you are requested to test a firearm, when you're doing these test fires, is that the process of making sure the firearm is functional?
Yes.
During your inspection of the safeties that you described, is that also a part of your analysis of whether or not a firearm is actually functional?
Yes.
When you analyze a firearm to see if the safeties are working or whether or not it's functional, do you ever receive projectiles or cartridge casings as well?
Yes.
What are you an expert at doing when you have a projectile, casings, and a firearm as a forensic lab firearms analyst?
I am tasked to determine whether or not those bullets or cartridge cases were fired in or from that firearm.
I want to talk about that process in detail. When you are tasked with analyzing whether or not a cartridge casing came from a specific firearm, walk us through the process. How is that done?
Once I've test fired the firearm, I'm going to bring those test fires back, and I'm going to then look at the class characteristics that are on those cartridge cases. I'm going to document them on the firearm worksheet, and then I'm going to take out each of the evidence cartridge cases that I receive, and I'm going to document each one of those. I'm going to look to see what the class characteristics are on that particular cartridge case. So a class characteristic is something that's predetermined by the manufacturer, and it could be typical of other guns, not just that particular gun. An example would be the shape of the firing pin, the shape of the firing pin aperture, that's the hole that the firing pin sticks out of, and what type of marks I see on that cartridge case. In order for me to do that, I use a comparison microscope, which allows me to see two things at the same time at the same magnification. Now, if those class characteristics on the cartridge cases are the same class characteristics that I see on the firearm, I can then begin another part of the examination, which is called looking for the individual characteristics or the pattern of individual characteristics. The pattern of individual characteristics is unique to that firearm, and it's caused by the manufacturing process itself, and it also can come from the use, abuse, erosion, corrosion of the firearm. So when I'm looking, I want to see if those individual characteristics that I see on the cartridge case are the same individual characteristics that are on the test fire or the other cartridge cases that I have received.
That was a lot of information. Let's go back. Class characteristics. When you are test firing a firearm, and for instance, looking at the casing that comes out during the test fire, help us understand, how do those class characteristics get there?
So when the firearm is fired, the cartridge case, the first thing that's going to happen is the firing pin is going to strike that primer. And it's going to leave an impression of the shape of that firing pin on the primer of the cartridge case.
If I can stop you right there, I apologize. You've used the term firing pin and primer.
Yes.
What are those, and where are they located within a firearm?
The firing pin is located inside the slide, in the center of the slide, back portion of it, in the firearm. It's the portion that will be released forward when you are ready to fire the firearm. And a primer is that circle that you see on the back of a cartridge case, and that is where the spark comes from on a cartridge.
Okay, so the firing pin and the primer, you were explaining the process of how those class characteristics get on the actual casing that is expelled. Please continue, I'm sorry.
So the firing pin will make an impression onto that primer, which will then cause an explosion. The light that, or I'm sorry, the spark that comes from the primer will ignite the gunpowder that's inside the cartridge, which in turn will make the bullet go down the barrel, but it will also force that cartridge case back against the back portion of the slide, and it will also leave marks in the on the back or the primer of that cartridge case. At that point, then the cartridge case gets expelled from the firearm.
Now, what about individual characteristics? You said the individual characteristics that are left on a cartridge casing differ. They're not the same.
From firearm to firearm.
Okay, so let's talk about a projectile, for instance. What happens to a projectile as it's going through to be ejected or fired from a firearm?
When the cartridge is ignited and the bullet goes down the barrel, the bullet will travel down the barrel and it will get class characteristics from inside the barrel, which are the rifling inside the barrel, which are those spiral grooves that you see within the interior of the barrel. Those will be imparted onto the bullet. That's a class characteristic. Multiple firearms may have the same class characteristics. At that same time, it's also getting individual characteristics imparted onto it.
Those impressions are class characteristics and individual characteristics. Is that what allows you to analyze a test fire to a projectile that's already been fired to see whether or not they match?
Yes.
Before you kind of started to describe using a microscope to compare the two, the test fire that happens in a controlled environment and the one that's actually expelled. Help us understand how you do that.
The first thing I do is I want to make sure each of those items has individual characteristics. I can't continue my examination if it does not have any individual characteristics. If it does have individual characteristics, I can compare the item of evidence to a test fire or to other items of evidence.
In this case, tell the jury, so what happens next?
If I see repeating patterns of individual characteristics on the item, then I can make identifications.
And again, you're looking at these class characteristics and individual characteristics on a test fire and a projectile provided to you under a microscope, correct?
Correct.
Now, tell us about the test firing process. When you receive a firearm and you're requested to test fire it, where do you do that?
I test fire it into the section water tank.
What does the water tank look like?
The water tank is essentially a big steel box that has a port on one end, and you'll fire the firearm into that port.
Is it just like a big open area that you aim at and fire in, or is it a defined area?
There is a small port at the front of the tank. The tank is filled with water. I aim the firearm into that port, and then the bullets will be collected from the water.
How many times do you think in your career as a firearms analyst have you done this process of firing a firearm into this water tank with this port at the front?
I haven't counted, but I would assume at this point in the thousands.
When you're test firing firearms, are they all of the same type or are they different types?
As far as the cartridge,
No, of the firearms that you're asked to fire.
I have test fired many different firearms.
Have you test fired a Glock 43 as the same as the one that was involved in this case and provided to you?
43 or 42?
42.
Yes, I have.
And for reference, I'll show you what's been entered into evidence as State Exhibit 16. I'm going to place it in front of you. Where you provided State's Exhibit, was it 16? 16 to test fire.
May I check the box? Yes, I was.
How do you know?
I could see the case number, the exhibit number, and my initials in my handwriting on the firearm and the magazine.
Each firearm that you receive for testing, does it get an individual case number associated with it that you just explained is representative on this firearm?
It gets an individual property item number or exhibit number, and it will have a case number, and then I will write those things on the firearm or the date and my initials on them. In this case, I wrote all of that myself.
When you receive a firearm, I heard you talk about some of your training includes the assembly and disassembly of the firearm when deciding whether or not a firearm is operable. Is that correct?
Yes.
Did you do that in this case? Is that a part of your evaluation when you receive a firearm, is assembling and disassembling, disassembling and then assembling the firearm?
I test fired the firearm first, and then I did remove the slide to check the safeties.
Okay, so how many occasions have you had in your career to fire a Glock 42 specifically?
I don't have a specific number. I've fired many Glocks, though.
Do you think over 100 times in your career is safe to say, approximately?
Yes.
Now, let's talk about your understanding and your education or background in the brand of Glock. What do you know about the brand of Glock?
I did take a Glock armorer's course when I began my training at the Florida Department of Law Enforcement, and I'm very aware of how the Glock operates.
Tell us how the Glock operates. And I guess while you're explaining that, can you specify how it operates and how it may be different than other brands?
Do you want me to start of how to essentially fire the Glock?
Sure.
In order to test fire or to fire a Glock, the first thing you need to do is to load ammunition into the magazine. That's the container that holds the cartridges so that you can fire one right after the other. The next thing you're going to need to do is take that top portion of the firearm and you're going to have to pull the slide back and release it. I'm sorry, after you've inserted the magazine into the mag well. Then you're going to take that slide back and release it. The first cartridge in that magazine will now be inserted into the chamber of the firearm, and the firearm is ready to fire. When you released that slide at the top of the firearm, at that same time, the firing pin has been slightly cocked in the firearm. That means it's been pulled back ever so slightly. Now the firearm is ready to fire. When I pull the trigger, I have to depress the trigger itself, and there's also a trigger safety on this particular firearm. I have to depress the trigger safety and the trigger at the same time in order for that firearm to fire. When I pull that trigger, the firearm will fire, the bullet will go down the barrel, the slide will move back, and the cartridge case will be extracted and ejected from the firearm. At the same time, the slide will now start moving back forward. It will take the next cartridge out of the magazine and it will load it into the chamber. And it will have now repeated the process that happened again.
On the Glock brand specifically, help us understand the safety precautions that are present on Glock firearms.
The Glock has the trigger safety, which is located on the trigger. It's in the center. It kind of protrudes a little bit from the trigger itself. It's right down the middle. You have to depress it in order for the trigger to be pulled back. The Glock also has a firing pin block safety, which in order for that firing pin block to get out of the way of the firing pin, you have to pull the trigger. And again, in order to pull the trigger, you have to depress the trigger safety. This firearm also has what is known as a drop safety. All that particular thing is doing is it's holding back that firing pin, and then it will pull it back a little bit more and then drop out of the way. And the firearm will not fire unless that has dropped out of the way.
So, for instance, with this firing pin block safety, does that help prevent things like accidental shootings?
The firing pin block safety will not allow the firing pin to go forward unless the trigger has been pulled.
The trigger safety you've described as a small object on the middle of the trigger. If the trigger safety is depressed, but not the entire trigger behind it, will a Glock 42 fire?
If just the safety has been depressed, no, it will not fire. You have to finish pulling the trigger.
Help us understand the difference of the terms semi-automatic firearm and automatic firearm, excuse me.
A semi-automatic firearm requires a pull of the trigger for every shot that is fired. A fully automatic firearm, all you have to do is depress the trigger, and as long as there is ammunition in the magazine and you're still depressing that trigger, it will continue to fire.
The Glock 42 that we see in Space 16 that's sitting on the ledge in front of you, is that a semi-automatic firearm or is that an automatic firearm?
It's a semi-automatic firearm.
Does that mean in order for the firearm to be fired multiple times, you would have to both depress the trigger safety and the trigger in its entirety multiple times in order to fire it?
Correct.
Asked in another way, does it require you to completely pull and then release it before pulling it again to continue firing it?
You will pull, and then you have to release pressure. It doesn't mean your finger's still not there. It may be putting a little pressure, but it does have to be fully extended again in order for you to pull again.
If a Glock 42 with these safety features, which you've described on the Glock 42 in front of you, were to, for instance, be dropped, would it be able to go off?
With the firing pin block safety, it would not go off.
I want to talk about the process of test firing again. You described to us the water tank that you fire into. Using your hands, can you raise your hands up and show the jury exactly how big is that, I forget what you called it, oh, the port that you fire into?
It's approximately 6 inches wide.
Approximately 6 inches wide. And is that standard for you? You've done that in every case where you've fired firearms into this water tank?
Not every firearm will get fired into the water tank, but most do.
Okay, so when you test fired this firearm into a water tank that had a 6-inch wide port, how many hands did it require you to use on the firearm to point and aim it correctly in the hole?
I used to.
Overruled.
You can answer it.
I use 2 hands.
Why did you use 2 hands?
I want to make sure I'm holding the firearm firmly so it will cycle properly.
We sometimes hear in conjunction with firearms terms such as recoil. What is recoil?
Recoil is the amount of force that's going to come back at you after you have test fired a firearm or fired a firearm. It causes a little bit of force into your hand.
A Glock 42, or I guess maybe even the Glock brand in general, what is the recoil based on your training and your experience firing Glocks, what is the recoil like in firearms?
Depends on the firearm. For Glock, I do have some recoil when I'm firing the firearm. It's not the same as other firearms.
Does the recoil depend on the caliber and type of firearm?
It can.
So when you're holding a firearm and you're firing, for instance, into your water tank, or you're trying to aim, how do you combat the recoil that you would experience of the firearm after it, or as it's fired, excuse me?
I am using two hands when I test fire, and then I just wait in between shots to make sure I can aim and make sure I am aimed properly into the port.
May I have just a moment, Judge?
Yes.
In this case, were you provided shell casings and projectiles in order to do a comparison after you test fired the firearm?
Yes.
Tell us about that process.
I received bullets and cartridge cases in this case, and I obtained them from the evidence section, and then I brought them back in order to compare them to my test fires of this firearm.
How many test fires did you have when you test fired this firearm?
I test fired this firearm twice.
How many do you use of the? How many of the test fires do you use when you're placing it on the microscope and you're looking at it in comparison to the ones that you're provided from the scene?
I used one bullet, one cartridge case.
Is that standard?
You could use multiple test fires if needed, or multiple bullets or cartridge cases. It depends on the scenario.
Did you need to do that in this case?
In this particular case, I did not.
Why?
They were well marked.
Okay, so you test fire it, you have a test casing and a test projectile. How many projectiles did you receive either from the scene or from the deceased?
I received 3 fired bullets and 1 fired bullet core.
Did you compare those bullets to your test fire?
I compared the fired bullets to each other and to the test fire.
What's the purpose of comparing the fired bullets to each other?
I had originally, when I was going through to see the individual characteristics, I noticed that they all had the same individual characteristics, and I could see marks that looked similar on each of them as I put each one up individually, and then I put them up together to just index them or mark them to see those patterns were the same at that point.
After you compared the test fires to each other, did you choose one and compare it to each projectile or bullet that you were provided in this case?
In this particular case, I compared the bullets to each other first, and I took one of them and I compared it to a test fire.
Why do you compare the bullets provided to you from the scene or the deceased to each other first?
In this particular case, there was no reason why I did that over looking at them to the test fire. It's just I had seen the pattern when I was looking at them individually, so I marked them at the time.
What is your expert opinion about the projectiles that you were provided associated with this case that you received from either the scene or the deceased?
I identified them to the firearm.
And are you talking the firearm in front of you, State's Exhibit 16?
Yes.
Does that mean that the projectiles that you were provided and used during your analysis came from State's Exhibit 16, a Glock 42 that's in front of you?
Yes.
What about the cartridge casings? Were you provided cartridge casings and asked to compare them in this case?
Yes.
How did you do that?
I took those cartridge cases, I looked at them each individually and made sure they had individual characteristics, and then I compared them. In this particular instance, I compared each cartridge case to a test fire.
When you compared each cartridge case that was found at the scene of this event to the test fire, tell the jury what your results were.
I determined that they were identified to the firearm here in front of me.
Does that mean that those cartridge casings were expelled from the firearm that's sitting in front of you?
Yes.
Judge, may I have just a moment?
Yes.
I don't have any further questions. I will take just one moment to return.
for us?
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
Now, you were involved in doing some analysis in this case, and then later on, you were asked to do some additional analysis more recently.
That is correct.
And that was based on the retirement of one of the FDLE examiners that was involved in the case, Mr. Kwong.
That's what I'm assuming, yes.
Okay. But you had originally done some test fires in the case and did an examination of the firearm.
That is correct.
So then later, when you were asked to continue to review the case or review the rest of the evidence, you were able to use those original test fires that you used in this case.
That is correct.
And you were able to identify those casings to each other and to the firearm in this case.
In this particular case, I ID'd each cartridge case back to a test fire.
Okay. And that test fire was from this firearm that you were shown a minute ago.
Yes.
When you looked at the ammunition, there was two types of ammunition, right, from the casings?
Correct.
And what were the types of ammunition?
There were two types, Hornady and Norma.
Okay. And both of those are obviously 380.
Correct.
Now, Ms. Reeder was asking you about the safety features on the Glock, on the firearm in this case, and you said that there's the trigger and the trigger safety, and then there's the firing pin block safety, correct?
There's the trigger safety, the firing pin block safety, and the drop safety.
Okay. And all of those, as you pull back the trigger, will go along and allow you to fire the gun.
That is correct.
It's not something that you have to do separately. It all kind of goes together as you pull the trigger.
Correct. As you're depressing the trigger along with that trigger safety, and you pull the trigger all the way back, it will release, I'm sorry, not release, but disengage the firing pin block safety, allowing that firing pin to flow through the channel.
Adults could fire this firearm, correct?
I would assume so.
Okay. And children could fire this type of firearm.
I can't determine whether or not anybody particularly could fire a firearm, but is it possible? Yes.
Okay. And in fact, you're able to test for trigger pull. Is that correct?
I do have a way of measuring trigger pull, yes.
But in this case, you did not do that.
No.
And that would tell you the force needed to pull the trigger with this particular firearm.
That is correct.
When you did do the test fires, you didn't find anything unique about this firearm versus any other kind of Glock that you've used before.
The trigger pull didn't seem any different than any other Glock that I've fired.
And typically, you've stated that the trigger pull for a firearm is about like opening a can of soda.
Correct.
Nothing further.
Anything else?
No, Judge.
All right, you can step down, ma'am, thank you. She released from her subpoena?
Yes, Judge.